Have you ever wondered why silence can be more devastating than any scream, any final argument, or any act of revenge? Let's challenge a belief you've probably held for years: that walking away quietly is weak, passive, even cowardly. That unless you fight back, demand closure, make your pain known, you haven't truly stood up for yourself. That's the myth we've been sold. But what if the real power lies in restraint? What if walking away, without explanation, without chaos, is the ultimate act of strength? And not just strength, but stoic strength, rooted in calm, clarity, and a deep, unshakable understanding of your own worth. You see, the truth is, some people only respect your boundaries once your silence makes them undeniable. They don't listen when you speak your pain, but they start questioning everything when you stop speaking at all. This video isn't about how to get revenge. It's not about playing games or performing strength. It's about embodying it. It's about understanding a Stoic relationship principle. Sometimes, the strongest move is the one that makes no noise at all. No begging. No yelling. No pleading for someone to understand you. Just peace. Just walking. Just reclaiming your presence, your energy, and your power. Because here's what no one tells you: when you disappear from someone's life without theatrics, you leave behind a mirror. A brutal, unrelenting reflection of everything they ignored, denied, or damaged. So let me ask you, have you ever stayed too long, thinking your loyalty would eventually be seen for what it was? Have you ever kept pouring into someone who was too distracted by their own ego to realize the depth of what you gave? Have you ever watched someone treat your patience like a default setting, as if you never leave because you never had before? If any of this resonates, then stay with me. Because what you're about to hear might not only validate your experience, but completely transform how you understand your own power. This isn't just a story. It's a reckoning. It's a journey through pain, clarity, and finally, healing. Each section will take you deeper into what really happens when you choose yourself without needing applause for it. We're going beyond emotional noise and into emotional truth. And by the end of this video, you'll see why that quiet walk into your future wasn't just the beginning of your freedom. It was the echo that destroyed them. Not with violence. Not with drama. But with the one thing they never expected: peace. So buckle in. Let's dive into what happens after the last word is never spoken. Let's talk about the devastating, transformative, liberating power of walking away quietly. 1. The calm exit they never anticipated. They were ready for a war. They had braced themselves for the kind of goodbye that leaves doors slammed, phones blown up with unread messages, and the dramatic energy of a person who couldn't handle the pain of being mistreated. They expected you to react, to fall apart, to come undone. But instead, you gave them nothing. No speech. No tears. No confrontation. Just silence. Just absence. And in that silence, you dismantled the illusion they had of their power over you. Think about that. How often do people prepare for every kind of emotional battle except the one where you simply don't show up to fight? Your stillness wasn't a void. It was a weapon. Not one crafted in malice, but in discipline. Not one designed to destroy, but to reflect. Because what happens when the person they assumed would never leave doesn't say goodbye, doesn't explain, doesn't even flinch, but just leaves? That's where the reckoning begins. That's where their mind starts replaying every moment they dismissed your concerns, brushed off your loyalty, ignored your boundaries. This is the kind of departure that Stoicism teaches us to honor, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. You didn't stay to be right. You left to be free. And freedom isn't loud. It's quiet, deliberate, and deeply unsettling to those who thought they had you figured out. They built their control on the foundation of your reactions. Your emotion validated their presence. Your frustration proved they still had influence. But when you walked away without offering that last bit of energy, they were stripped of the narrative they needed to feel justified. This is what Stoic relationships reveal. The person who remains centered in the midst of betrayal becomes the one who controls the outcome, not through manipulation, but through grace. Your peace disturbed them because it wasn't dramatic. It was absolute. And it made them ask the questions they never wanted to face. Why didn't you chase them? Why didn't you demand answers? Why didn't you crumble? Because you didn't need to. You finally realized that some people thrive on chaos simply because it keeps them from having to confront the truth about who they are. And your silence forced them into that confrontation. You see, they were counting on the performance. The cries, the blame, the emotional unraveling. That would have given them something familiar to hold on to, a reason to keep seeing themselves as the victim or the misunderstood soul who couldn't love properly because they were just damaged. But your stillness? That left no room for interpretation. No false hope. No emotional loopholes. Just truth. You didn't tell them you were done. You showed them. And in doing so, you held up a mirror that shattered every excuse they had ever used to justify how they treated you. That's the beauty, and the brutal honesty, of Stoicism. It doesn't seek revenge. It seeks clarity. It doesn't need to scream to be heard. It lets the silence speak volumes. You were the emotional equilibrium they abused without understanding its worth. But when that balance was removed, their world collapsed under the weight of their own chaos. And let's be clear, your quiet exit wasn't about pride. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about reclaiming your peace without having to ask for permission. That's a kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself. It just moves. It just exits. And leaves a void so sharp, so undeniable, it becomes the loudest presence in their life. They thought they were prepared. But they weren't ready for your calm. They weren't ready for a version of you that didn't explain, didn't argue, didn't apologize for needing something more than what they could give. And maybe that's the hardest part for them now. Knowing that the very thing they took for granted, your emotional investment, was the very thing they can no longer access. You didn't walk away because you stopped caring. You walked away because you finally understood that no amount of care can fix a person who refuses to see their reflection. That's the paradox, isn't it? They pushed, and pushed, and pushed, thinking you would always stay. That your loyalty was limitless. That your love had no boundaries. But love without respect is not love, it's sacrifice. And sacrifice without appreciation becomes self-betrayal. You didn't leave to hurt them. You left to stop hurting yourself. And if you had made a scene, they could have used it. They could have weaponized your emotion, twisted the story, and continued believing in the lie that they were the stable one and you were the one who overreacted. But you gave them no such fuel. You gave them stillness. You gave them dignity. And in return, they were left with their own conscience. This is why Stoicism is not about suppressing emotion. It's about channeling it. About refusing to let those who lack self-awareness dictate your emotional landscape. You showed them that peace is not passivity, it's power. And now they're living in the aftermath of your decision, not your anger. That's the difference between emotional maturity and emotional manipulation. They tried to pull you into the storm. You chose to be the eye of it instead. So the question becomes, what do people do when the drama they expected never arrives? When the person they thought they broke refuses to break down? They spiral. They question. They obsess. Not because they want you back, but because they can't understand how you left without needing them to notice. That's the part that haunts them. That's what truly destroys someone who is counting on your dependency to feel in control. And that's why the moment you walked away, calmly, completely, and without the need to prove anything, they started to unravel. They weren't expecting silence. But it's all they hear now. 2. The withdrawal of emotional energy. What they never realized, until it was too late, was that your presence was more than physical. It was energetic, emotional, soulful. You weren't just someone who showed up in their life. You were someone who poured in. Consistently, quietly, faithfully. And when you walked away, you didn't just take your body, you took your energy, your emotional investment, your constant consideration of their needs. And that absence? It wasn't just noticed, it was felt deeply. You see, people who thrive on control, on manipulation, on emotional imbalance, They don't just want attention, they need it. It feeds them. Your energy was their supply, and they never thought you'd cut it off. That's why when you stopped showing up, stopped answering the calls, stopped checking in to make sure they were okay, everything began to unravel. Not because you made them feel small with words, but because you removed the validation they had come to depend on. You stopped giving them the daily confirmation that they mattered, that someone cared, that their presence was worth something. And ironically, it was in your quiet withdrawal that they finally realized just how much they were being carried, not by their own strength, but by yours. This is what Stoicism teaches us in Stoic Relationships. Emotional energy is sacred. It's not infinite. And when it's constantly poured into someone who gives nothing back, that energy becomes currency spent on illusions. You were that current. You were the light they mistook for their own. But when it was gone, they saw their reality for what it was: hollow, unstable, lonely. The most dangerous lie they believed was that you would never leave, that your devotion was permanent. But even the strongest well runs dry when it's never refilled. So when you stopped pouring, when you stopped checking on their emotions before your own, they lost something they couldn't replace. They lost influence. And with that loss came chaos. Not yours. Theirs. Because now they had to sit in the silence of your absence and feel what it was like to be unimportant, unprioritized, unseen. And let's not confuse this with revenge. It wasn't. This wasn't about playing games. It was about returning to yourself, recognizing your peace as a priority instead of an afterthought. And that recognition? That's what took everything away from them. Because they never expected you to choose yourself. They were used to the version of you that gave endlessly, that forgave easily, that waited patiently. But when you walked away, all of that vanished. The forgiveness, the benefit of the doubt, the emotional labor. It disappeared, and they felt that disappearance like a cold gust through a room that once felt warm. And maybe the most tragic part is that they didn't see the cost of their behavior until you were no longer there to soften it. When you stopped giving, they had to reckon with how much they'd been taking. This is why Stoicism isn't cold, it's clarity. It's the strength to detach when the connection becomes destructive. It's the wisdom to say, I will no longer abandon myself just to keep someone else emotionally comfortable. And that shift, that realignment of loyalty back to yourself, was the earthquake they never saw coming. Because emotional energy is invisible until it's gone. Then its absence becomes undeniable. And in your case, it became a void so wide, so deep, that no temporary distraction could fill it. They tried, of course. They looked for your light in other people. They searched for the same level of understanding, the same compassion, the same soul-deep care. But no one else offered what you did. Because what you gave wasn't surface-level attention. It was devotion. It was seeing them when they didn't even see themselves. It was holding their broken pieces without judgment. That kind of energy doesn't come from obligation. It comes from love. And love, when exhausted, doesn't scream. It just stops. So ask yourself, how often did you pour from an empty cup? How many times did you set yourself on fire to keep them warm? And how long did it take before you realized that no amount of energy would ever be enough for someone who refuses to heal themselves? They were addicted to your light, but allergic to the responsibility that came with it. They wanted the benefit of your care without the burden of accountability. But when you stopped giving, they were left exposed. Left with the truth. That they never stood on their own, they stood on you. And the moment you stepped back, they collapsed into themselves. That's not your guilt to carry. That's their lesson to learn. Because your energy was never theirs to exploit. It was yours to protect. And now that you've reclaimed it, your glow is different. Stronger. Sharper. Not guarded, but sacred. That's what Stoicism does. It doesn't harden your heart. It refines your direction. It makes you aware of where your energy goes, and who's truly worthy of receiving it. And the ones who feel the loss the most? They're the ones who assumed they'd always have access to it. But now they don't. Now they're just watching you from afar, wondering how you became so untouchable, so whole. And it's because you took back the power they didn't even realize they were stealing. Your withdrawal wasn't weakness, it was a reckoning. And if you're watching this and feeling that truth in your bones, then let it settle. Let it empower you. And if this part of the story speaks to something you've experienced, like the video and comment, number 1, below to let others know they're not alone in that feeling. And if you're finding strength in these truths, make sure to subscribe, because this journey of reclaiming peace and power in Stoic relationships isn't over. It's just getting started. 3. Misinterpretation of kindness and loyalty. One of the most tragic illusions in broken relationships is the way kindness is mistaken for weakness, how patience is seen as permission, and how loyalty is assumed to be blindness. They thought your ability to endure was rooted in dependency. They mistook your quiet tolerance as ignorance. But the truth is, you saw everything. You noticed every shift in tone, every passive-aggressive remark, every dismissive glance, and each subtle way they made you feel like your needs were too much or your emotions too inconvenient. You weren't blind. You were just hoping. Hoping they'd grow. Hoping they'd recognize your heart. Hoping they'd rise to meet the version of themselves you saw beneath their dysfunction. That wasn't foolish, it was faithful. But they took that faith and treated it like a guarantee. They leaned on your compassion without ever considering its cost. They kept testing your boundaries, pushing the limits, assuming that because you hadn't walked away yet, you never would. But kindness is not submission. Loyalty is not a contract written in permanence. At its core, loyalty in Stoic relationships is a sacred agreement, offered freely, but sustained only through mutual respect. You weren't staying because you were lost. You were staying because you believed in redemption. And they failed to see the courage that takes. The strength of holding on when it would be easier to let go. The inner discipline of forgiving, again and again, without demanding applause. This is the part where most people get it twisted. They think endurance means ignorance. That if someone doesn't confront every slight, they must not be aware of it. But awareness doesn't always speak, it observes. It waits. It calculates. And that's what you were doing. You were collecting truth. Watching the inconsistencies pile up. Measuring whether their intentions matched their actions. Whether the love they claimed to offer actually showed up when it mattered. You were giving them time. Space. A chance. And they misread that patience as passivity. That's the danger of underestimating someone whose love is deep. They think just because you stay silent, you're unarmed. But silence is a sword. It's the space in which self-respect sharpens. And when the time came, that same silence was what cut the cord. The silence that once held space for them became the silence that buried the illusion of their control. That's why they're spiraling now. Because they assumed your forgiveness was endless. That your loyalty came with no terms. But you were never theirs to own. Your presence was a gift, not a given. And when they used your loyalty as a cushion for their chaos, they mistook your consistency for neediness. They thought, if they're still here, it must mean they'll never leave. But Stoicism isn't about staying stuck. It's about staying centered. It's about knowing the moment your peace is being poisoned, and choosing to walk away, not in anger, but in clarity. They failed to understand that what you gave was rooted in choice, not obligation. You didn't owe them that many chances. You chose to offer them. Because that's who you are, someone who doesn't give up easily, someone who invests in people deeply. But even the deepest well has a limit. And when it runs dry, nothing can grow. So yes, you stayed longer than you should have. Not because you were weak, but because you believed in love's potential. You were fighting for connection, for growth, for shared evolution. But they weren't fighting beside you. They were fighting you. And eventually, that became clear. They weren't just resisting change, they were resisting accountability. Every time you brought up something that hurt, they dismissed it. Every time you tried to set a boundary, they pushed back. Not because they didn't understand, it's because they didn't want to change. And in that resistance, your loyalty became a weight. You began carrying both your pain and their refusal to face it. That's what made you tired. That's what drained your spirit. And yet, for so long, you blamed yourself for being tired. You thought maybe if you just explained it better, they'd get it. Maybe if you were a little more patient, they'd see your side. But you weren't the problem. Your expectations weren't the issue. Their unwillingness to meet them was. That's the turning point. That's when you begin to see the difference between love and emotional labor. Between being there for someone and being used by someone. And when that truth clicks, you can't unsee it. That's when the kindness that once forgave everything finally decides to forgive yourself. That's when the loyalty that once held everything together finally decides to let go. And once that decision is made, it's done. Because when someone with a stoic soul chooses to walk away, they don't look back. Not out of spite, but because the clarity of truth doesn't require revisiting. You gave them every chance. You showed up even when they didn't. You loved them not for who they were, but for who they could become. But that was your mistake. They never asked to become that version. They never chose to evolve. They just chose to enjoy the benefits of your belief without doing the work. And that's what ultimately broke the bond. Not one fight. Not one betrayal. But the slow, painful realization that your love was being taken for granted, and your loyalty was being used as an excuse for their stagnation. And now that you're gone, they're finally waking up. Finally seeing how rare your kind of presence is. But it's too late. Because the kindness they abused is now kindness turned inward. The loyalty they misread is now loyalty to your peace. And the patience they took advantage of is now the patience you show yourself as you heal, rebuild, and rise. This is what Stoicism demands. Not that you stop feeling, but that you stop bleeding for people who use your blood to write excuses. And now, they're left with their guilt, their choices, and the haunting echo of what they thought would always be there. 4. The mirror effect of your silence. Silence is not absence, it is exposure. And when you finally chose to walk away without a word, without justification, without one last plea for understanding, you became a mirror. A quiet, unrelenting mirror reflecting everything they had done. Not the version of events they told themselves. Not the story they painted to others. But the raw, unfiltered truth. Because silence doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't offer a new perspective to spin. It just exists, like a void that swallows all the noise and forces them to sit alone with their choices. That's what they were never prepared for. As long as you were talking, they could twist your words. As long as you were engaging, they had a foothold in the story. As long as you reacted, they still felt powerful. But when you said nothing, they were stripped of their tools. The silence made their past actions undeniable. Every manipulation, every dismissal, every moment you were made to feel invisible or too much. All of it came back, not through confrontation, but through reflection. And that's the curse of hurting someone who is self-aware and emotionally grounded. Their exit doesn't create chaos. It creates consequences. The silence you left behind was like a hall of echoes. At first, it was just quiet. Then, it became unbearable. Because nothing screams louder than the conscience of someone who finally has no distractions to hide behind. And that silence? It wasn't empty. It was filled with all the things they ignored while you were still there. Your concern. Your patience. Your voice. All now gone. And it's in that space that their internal war begins. Because for the first time, they can't pretend. There's no emotional noise to drown it out. No frantic dialogue to shift the blame. No argument to redirect the narrative. Just them, and the realization that they broke something sacred. This is where Stoicism becomes the most disarming force of all. Not because it punishes, but because it reveals. When you walk away with calm instead of chaos, you give them nothing to fight, but everything to feel. And that is what truly destroys someone who lacks emotional maturity. Not your rage, but your stillness. Not your words, but your absence. And maybe now they scroll through your old messages. They replay your voice in their head. They hear your old concerns with new ears. And what used to feel like nagging now sounds like wisdom. What used to feel like pressure now feels like protection. But there's no one left to explain that to. You're not there anymore. And without you, they're left trying to piece together what went wrong, only now realizing it wasn't one moment. It was all the moments they failed to take you seriously. It wasn't one mistake, it was the pattern of neglect, of entitlement, of selfishness. And now that you've taken your emotional mirror away, they're left trying to see themselves clearly, and it's terrifying. Because they don't like what they see. They miss the version of themselves that existed in your eyes. The version that felt redeemable, capable, loved despite the flaws. But that version only existed because you saw it. You believed in it. You reflected it back to them. And without you, all they have now is the distortion. The unfiltered reality. That's what Stoic relationships teach us. Not everyone deserves access to our light. Especially those who only see it when it's gone. And now they can't stop remembering. The quiet way you used to support them. The soft strength in your presence. The consistent love you offered without conditions. And the brutal part is, they know they'll never find it again. Not because no one else will love them, but because no one else will know them the way you did. That's the difference. You saw beneath their performance. You loved past the walls. You reflected their soul, not just their image. And when that kind of mirror disappears, it leaves behind a ghost. A longing that can't be filled by temporary affection or shallow validation. It haunts them. Not because they lost you, but because they finally see the truth of who they were when you were there, and who they are now that you're not. And that shift? That awakening? It doesn't fade. Because silence doesn't stop echoing. It grows. It becomes the voice in the quiet moments. The question mark in new relationships. The ache that no one else seems to understand. This is what happens when a person finally realizes that the one they took for granted was the only one who truly saw them. And that is what destroys them, not vengeance, not rage, but the unrelenting truth. And if you've ever been that mirror, if you've ever felt that moment when your silence became the loudest thing in the room, then you understand the power of walking away with dignity. If this part of the journey has resonated with you, if you've felt the haunting silence that only real emotional absence can create, then do something powerful right now. Like this video and comment, number 1, below to let others know they're not alone in their silence. And if this message reflects something real in your own story, subscribe to the channel. Because your strength, your growth, and your peace deserve to be honored, not just survived. 5. The rare gift they lost. What they failed to recognize in time was that you weren't just a presence. They were standing in the light of something irreplaceable. A rare kind of loyalty. A depth of understanding that doesn't come from shallow affection or fleeting infatuation, but from conscious emotional investment. You were not just there. You were present in a way that few people ever are, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You didn't just offer your time, you gave your soul, your forgiveness, your unwavering belief in their potential. And the irony is, they only began to value it when it was already gone. There's something tragically human about that, isn't there? How we often only understand the weight of a gift after it's been withdrawn. You weren't asking to be worshipped. You weren't demanding constant praise. All you wanted was to be seen, for your efforts, for your patience, for the way you kept showing up even when it would have been easier to leave. But they didn't see it. Or maybe they did. But assumed you'd never run out. That your energy would always be available. That your loyalty was a permanent fixture, rather than a sacred choice. That's the difference between Stoic relationships and transactional ones. In Stoic relationships, loyalty isn't traded, it's offered. It's not about what someone can do for you in return. It's about who you decide to be, consistently, because it aligns with your values. And you were consistent, not because they earned it, but because you lived by principle. That's the strength they never understood. And when you disappeared from their world, they didn't just lose a person, they lost the mirror that reflected their worth back to them when they couldn't see it for themselves. You were the steady voice when their world fell apart. You were the one who held space when they acted like they didn't need anyone. You were the emotional sanctuary they didn't know they depended on until it vanished. And once you walked away, the walls started to collapse. Not because you cursed them, but because you were the one holding it all together behind the scenes. You were their safe place, the one they subconsciously turned to for grounding, even as they pushed you away. And now, with you gone, they're forced to confront a truth they didn't want to face, that you were never the weak one. You were the strong one. The anchor. The quiet warrior who bore their storms without asking for much in return. But even warriors get tired. Even anchors deserve rest. And you reached your limit, not with noise, but with finality. And now, in your absence, they feel the weight of every moment they overlooked your value. Every time they dismissed your needs. Every time they minimized your emotions. It plays on a loop now, not because you're reminding them, but because your silence leaves space for their conscience to speak. That's the haunting part of this kind of loss. It's not what you said. It's what you didn't say. The apologies you stopped waiting for. The love you stopped asking for. The future you stopped fighting for. It all lingers, not as bitterness, but as a ghost of what could have been. And no matter how far they run, no matter who they try to replace you with, there will always be that part of them that remembers what it felt like to be seen by someone who didn't demand perfection, only effort. That kind of love doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes the standard against which every other connection is unconsciously measured. And none of them measure up. Because those people might offer excitement, or attention, or even affection. But they won't offer the depth you did. They won't sit through the storm. They won't know how to hold the parts of them that are still healing. That's what you gave. That's what they lost. And it's a loss that will echo not in drama, but in quiet realizations. In the late-night thoughts. In the new relationship arguments where they suddenly miss your emotional maturity. In the small moments where they feel misunderstood and instinctively reach for your memory. That's the cost of disregarding something rare. It's not just about missing you. It's about realizing that they once had a chance to be loved by someone who was truly capable of loving without conditions, without games, without ego. But they weren't ready. Or worse, they were too selfish to rise to meet it. And now that you're gone, they understand. They see it. They feel it. They carry it. Because your love wasn't common. It was a gift. One they unwrapped too quickly, assumed would keep giving, and now can never rewrap again. And you? You finally understood something Stoicism always teaches, that your value is not diminished by someone's inability to see it. That walking away doesn't make you heartless. It proves your heart is too full to be wasted in places where it isn't honored. You didn't change. You remembered who you were. And in doing so, you reclaimed something sacred. Something rare. And now, they'll spend their quiet nights searching for someone who can offer even a shadow of what you did. But shadows don't warm hearts. And ghosts don't offer second chances. 6. The transformation they feared. What they feared most wasn't your anger. It was your evolution. Not the version of you that argued, that cried, that pleaded to be seen. But the version of you that no longer needed to be understood to find peace. That version was their undoing. Because they always believed your strength was tied to them, tied to the relationship, the fight, the possibility of a future you were always trying to save. They never anticipated what would happen when you stopped trying. When you stopped hoping. When you stopped needing them to validate your worth. That's when everything changed. You began to transform, not into someone colder, not into someone bitter, but into someone clear. Someone whose energy was no longer scattered trying to hold things together, but focused on building a life that no longer required apology. That transformation, rooted in Stoicism, is what finally revealed who they truly were. Not through your words, but through their inability to follow you into healing. Because you rose, and they stayed the same. And when you rise, you don't need to look back in rage. You look back in compassion, in understanding, in quiet clarity that says, "This is no longer mine to fix." That's the power of your growth. They expected drama. They expected you to fall apart without them. But instead, they watched as you smiled again, as you laughed again, as you built a world where their presence was no longer central to your happiness. And that terrified them, not because they wanted to join you in that joy, but because it proved something they didn't want to face, that they were never your source of strength. They were the test of it. You passed. They failed. Not in a way that requires gloating, but in a way that demands distance. You began to glow differently. The kind of glow that comes from nights spent alone healing, from boundaries enforced without guilt, from understanding that peace is not the absence of pain. It's the decision to stop handing your power to those who don't know what to do with it. That glow exposed everything they had ignored. Your light was no longer theirs to steal. And they noticed. In every photo you posted, in every silence you maintained, in every step you took forward without looking for permission, they noticed. That's what haunts them. Not your absence. Your freedom. Because that freedom is the final proof that they never had a hold on you, only a temporary lease on a heart that was always meant to soar beyond their reach. And now they're left with the noise. The internal chaos. The realization that what they feared you might become is exactly what you've become: unstoppable, peaceful, unavailable. You're no longer reactive. You're responsive. You're no longer desperate to be chosen. You've chosen yourself. You're no longer surviving love that hurts. You're thriving in love that heals, starting with your own. And that kind of transformation isn't loud. It's powerful. It echoes. It inspires. And most of all, it intimidates. Not because you tried to make anyone feel small, but because you finally refused to shrink. That's the legacy of a Stoic relationship. It doesn't end in destruction. It ends in evolution. And now, every move you make with grace, every boundary you keep with strength, every smile that doesn't need validation, reminds them of what they lost. They wanted control. What they got was a lesson. A lesson that peace is not weakness. That silence is not surrender. That your detachment is not bitterness. It's healing. It's clarity. It's the aftermath of choosing not to fight battles that never should have been yours in the first place. And if any part of your soul has resonated with this message, if you've ever felt the silent empowerment of walking away and never needing to return, now's your moment to claim that journey fully. Like this video and comment, number 1, if it spoke to you. And if you're ready for more truths like this, if you're choosing growth over chaos and stoicism over reactivity, then subscribe to the channel. Because this is only the beginning of the peace you were always meant to own. And now, we arrive at the quiet truth you've known all along, but perhaps have only just begun to articulate fully. Your absence was never about punishment. It was about protection. It was about reclaiming your dignity from a situation that slowly chipped away at it, piece by piece, while you kept hoping the love you gave would be enough to teach someone how to love you back. But love isn't taught through endurance. It's modeled through balance. It's nurtured through mutual responsibility. And when one person holds all the weight, carries both the hope and the healing, both the effort and the empathy, it ceases to be love and begins to become a slow erosion of the self. That erosion is what you stopped. Not with a dramatic finale, not with declarations or accusations, but with calm, deliberate silence. You walked away not because you hated them, but because you finally loved yourself more than the idea of being understood by someone who refused to try. That distinction is everything. Because when you love deeply, and you're also guided by stoicism, you don't react impulsively. You don't seek revenge. You don't burn bridges out of spite. Instead, you observe. You reflect. And when enough evidence accumulates that your presence is being devalued, you take the only action that truly honors both yourself and the connection you once believed in. You leave. Quietly. Cleanly. Completely. And in that final act, you offer the clearest message you've ever given. I am no longer available for your half-love, your projections, your avoidance of responsibility. I have stepped into my worth, and you no longer have access to it. They may never admit it, but your departure was their undoing. Because your silence disrupted the story they were telling themselves. It exposed the truth, That they were never the emotional center, you were. That they were never the pillar of strength, you were. That they didn't lose you because you gave up, but because they never truly showed up. And now, with you gone, they're not just grieving a person. They're grieving who they were when you loved them. Because in your presence they felt whole. They felt seen. They felt possible. Not because they were any of those things on their own, but because you saw the best in them and held space for them to grow into it. But when growth became an option they consistently refused, when accountability became something they dodged rather than embraced, you had no choice. You had to choose yourself, not because they weren't worthy of love, but because they weren't ready to receive the kind of love you offered. And that's the most brutal truth for them to accept. Because it means they weren't just a victim of a breakup. They were the architect of a loss. A loss so rare, so quietly monumental, that it now shadows every new connection they try to make. No one else sees them the way you did. No one else stays through their storms like you did. No one else listens with the kind of presence that says, "I hear you, even when you can't explain it." And while they may try to replicate that dynamic, it won't work, not because other people aren't good enough, but because your kind of energy isn't duplicable. It's forged through intentional love, through patience, through seeing someone in their darkness and choosing to believe in their light. That is not common. That is not replaceable. And that is not something they can just go out and find again. It's something they had, and lost, because they couldn't see past their ego long enough to treasure it. And you? You've changed too. Not into someone colder, but into someone wiser. Someone who no longer settles for potential, but honors patterns. Someone who understands that your time, your heart, your peace are not bargaining chips in a one-sided connection. Someone who has learned that healing isn't loud, it's silent, disciplined, and private. You're not angry. You're not bitter. You're just done. And that done isn't temporary. It's rooted. It's lived. It's built on the foundation of self-respect that once seemed negotiable, but now stands unshakable. You don't need to prove your worth anymore. You don't need them to see your value in retrospect. Because Stoicism has taught you that your peace is not something to be argued for. It's something to be protected, to be earned, to be prioritized. You've begun to live not from a place of scarcity, hoping someone will finally realize your value, but from a place of abundance, knowing that your value isn't something they can validate or take away. And this clarity has redefined your entire perspective on relationships. You no longer chase. You no longer justify. You no longer wait. You now observe. You listen to consistency. You trust energy more than promises. And that transformation, that inward shift, is what now shields you from repeating the past. That's the beauty of Stoicism applied to emotional healing. It doesn't ask you to be indifferent. It asks you to be discerning. It teaches you to love deeply, but without abandoning yourself. It allows you to grieve, but without losing yourself in the grief. It encourages you to feel fully, and then to let go when holding on becomes self-neglect. That is the power of your quiet walk away. It wasn't a resignation. It was a rebirth. And while they may never recover from the loss of you, you will thrive, not because you've found someone else, but because you've finally found peace within. And peace is not loud. Peace does not need to announce its arrival. Peace just is. It sits with you in the early mornings. It walks beside you in moments where you used to feel panic. It comforts you in spaces that used to be filled with overthinking. That's the life you're building now, not out of spite, but out of vision. And in time, they will see. Not because you need them to, but because the contrast between your glow and their guilt will become impossible to ignore. And when they look back, when they tried to piece together the moment they truly lost you, they won't be able to point to one explosive argument or one moment of betrayal. They will remember the silence, the stillness, the walkaway that left no door open. That is the moment they'll realize you didn't destroy them with hate. You destroyed them with the undeniable strength of peace. With a calm so pure, it left them with nothing but their reflection. That reflection? That's their lesson now. one you no longer have to be a part of, one you no longer have to bear witness to. Because your story continues, without them. Not bitter, but better. Not broken, but whole. Not loud, but free.